So, card breakdowns, the 10th, I guess. I think I'm going to cover Stonescar cards, and then if I still have the energy, I'm also going to do the colorless cards, since there aren't that many of them. And we'll also talk maybe very, very briefly about Nictotraxian. And by briefly, I mean at length. Nictotraxian's really fun. Alright. Anyways, let's go ahead and look at the Stonescar cards. We don't do that by typing Stonescar. We do it by hybriding. Yeah, there we go. Good. Okay. So, yeah, Stonescar cards. Stonescar is a faction that really likes mean, fast, aggressive cards, and a lot of sacrifice effects, as well in terms of like just being very good about basically spending resources to make damage or to make aggro. It's pretty strong in that aspect, and that tends to be its primary strength. It does have some other cool things going on with tokens, with just general go-wide strategies. We'll talk a little bit about those as we get to those cards. Combust is our first card. Sacrifice a unit to kill an enemy unit. Extremely cheap unconditional removal. This is 3 cheaper than Death Strike, which is the next best unconditional removal in terms of, or the next unconditional removal with an effect this strong. So the thing about Combust, of course, is that you have to sacrifice one of your own units. Fortunately, there are plenty of cool options at hand. Dark Wisp, Grenadin Drone, Slumbering Stone. There are a lot of good choices in Stonescar that really like to be sacrificed, so Combust is very good at turning those units into basically bombs. This card's very strong in ranked because token decks that have it just have unconditional removal, and that's a pretty strong thing to have in ranked. You can also use this card very quickly with cards with the card Madness to steal an enemy unit, combust, and kill another enemy unit. If you get that combo off, it requires a certain amount of things to happen all at once, but if you get that combo off, that is just an intense amount of card advantage, and it's very powerful. That same combo is very strong in draft as well, and that makes Combust just, Combust is a very strong draft card too. You do have to pick up cards like Dark Wisp and Slumbering Stone and Grenadin Drone to make it work, but you will probably be picking up those cards anyways. So if you manage to pick up some Combusts, then your deck gets a lot stronger for it. It's a very good draft card. It's a very good ranked card. The main thing that is very bad for is any deck in which you just don't have things to sacrifice that are good. It doesn't feel very good then. It's definitely card disadvantage and feels not amazing. Hair Trigger Stranger. Strangers have quick draw, 2/2. Another pretty good stranger. This card has a couple of issues, the main one being that it is another one of those strangers that on attack probably gets murdered and then makes all of your other strangers die. But in terms of just making really aggressive strangers happen, that's not bad. Like, it works well with Ruthless Stranger, which is the other red stranger. Having that type of synergy is pretty important. It works well with attacking strangers in general, which makes it good with Grim Stranger, a stranger that I've already called out as being probably one of the better ones. I think this one has a lot of potential, and there are some good decks with it already. Not amazing, but good decks with it already, and pretty cool stranger overall. I don't really like it in draft all that much. Having quick draw on your strangers is pretty strong, so it's worth it, but you just need strangers to make it work, and it doesn't really, a 2/2 quick draw isn't amazing in draft. There's just too many like 2/3 units that are sticking around, even though they're not good in ranked. So that's something to keep an eye on. But if you have like Determined Strangers, if you have Ruthless Strangers, then this card becomes inestimably better. So, worth a look. Obsidian Golem. Entomb. Draw a +2/+2 obsidian armor. Now, this card is quite strong at setting up a couple of different things. So, like, Alright. So here's the main strengths of this card. You have the Entomb effect of drawing a +2/+2 obsidian armor. That means Obsidian Golem functions pretty well as an aggressive 2-drop because it's got that 2/2 stat line. So it's pretty good in draft for that reason, because the stat line's not amazing in ranked, but it's okay in draft in particular. Like, it's just what you'd expect out of a 2-drop, and it's pretty good for its cost. Then the Entomb effect just makes you have another big unit. That's very effective in draft. It means that most people won't kill your Obsidian Golem, and you can get a lot of free damage in with it, which is typically a good way to win a Stonescar match, is to get a bunch of free damage, and then later on people realize how much they needed that health as you burn them with Flame Blast or Burnout or any other amount of cool things, and then sacrifice your Obsidian Golem anyways to a card like Combust or Burnout or Devour. all of which will just give you, you know, an extra card of value. Overall, the card's effect is not so powerful that it makes an amazing ranked card, but it can be used. I think it's mostly just good in draft because it definitely enhances a bunch of units that you want enhanced, and it's just good free damage. Nice and aggressive, really fun card to have. One of the better 2-drops in draft. Quarry. Draw one of the top 2 cards of your deck and reduce its cost by 1. Discard the other. Very, very strong card. Not in draft. It is a Jex Bounty card. But it is one of the primary reasons to buy Jex Bounty, actually. There are a couple of good cards in Jex Bounty, Jek included. Quite a lot of good cards in Jex Bounty, actually, but like of the ones that are most often used, Quarry is probably the most important one. This card's a staple in Armory now. It's just really, really good at picking out a particular card, and the cost reduction is really relevant because it makes a lot of things cheaper that shouldn't be, including Akaria and Smuggler's Stash, both of which are just terrifying at 6 and 4. Like these cards, like there are a lot of cards that when they are a little bit cheaper are a lot scarier. And that's something that Trail Stories is often trying to achieve, but Quarry just does better. So Quarry is really, really effective at just making, not only digging through your deck and finding cool things, but also making those things cheaper. And the discard effect is actually relevant too, because it means that you can discard a unit to a card or a weapon to a card like Smuggler's Stash, or a card like Vara the Fate Touched, which you can make cost 7. Quarry is just an amazing card in Stonescar decks. It does slow down your roll a little bit, which is not something that Stonescar decks usually like to do, but if you're playing any sort of control type burn deck, which a lot of Stonescar decks are, then Quarry is very, very strong. This is one of those things about Stonescar, and actually about all of the factions. All of the factions have a control bent, an aggro bent, and a mid-range bent of some kind. And it tends to be a little bit weird and a little bit different and based on whatever their faction is doing. For Stonescar, that control comes from the fact that it is a burn-heavy set that really likes removal and really likes damage. So you have both removal and direct damage from Shadow and Fire. And so like you actually get a really good control setup, and that means that cards like Quarry become a lot more useful. Yeah, so it's cool, cool stuff. All right, Treachery. Deal 2 damage to the enemy player. That player discards a unit of your choice from their hand. All right, so this card is relatively solid. It actually was seeing a lot of play as a sideboard card in tournaments. It hasn't been as popular lately, and I'm not actually sure why. It's still pretty relevant. The damage is very relevant. That makes this card better than Sabotage in my eyes, because people are more likely to have units than they are likely to have attachments, and basically it's just pretty likely to hit, and the 2 damage is also relevant for a lot of different reasons. So Treachery can see a decent amount of play in Ranked. It's not an amazing card for the same reason that Sabotage is not always an amazing card. Both of them are very, very good at like dismantling your opponent's hand, and I love that effect, and that effect is very powerful. But also, like, it's if it hits and it misses, that can just be so bad for your game. Like, it's really, really rough. So, like, you have to be a little bit careful about it. It belongs in more control archetypes than other things, but it's a pretty good card to have on hand. It's really, really good in... I almost would say that this card would be good in Armory. I've never seen anyone play it in Armory, but it's pretty fun. It's a very good counter Armory card, because if you have this card in, like, a Stonescar deck and you don't use it early, because you see that your opponent is running Armory, then later on when your opponent rises to the challenge, you can just Treachery and make them discard their Akaria, and that's just fun. Anyways, Treachery is fun, has some control archetype style, pretty decent burned card as well, so yeah, worth a look. Alright, Bloodrite Callus. Summon, sacrifice all of your units. Bloodrite Callus gets +2/+2 for each unit sacrificed. This card is way stronger than it looks, and it took a while for people to figure it out, but it was really, really fun. It's a very fun card for a lot of different reasons. So you can use this card again with Madness. You can use this card with anything that has like the sacrifice bonuses, like Dark Wisp or Grenadin Drone or Obsidian Golem. Just all of the things that are just really, really good with any of your other sacrifice effects are really good with Callus. And Callus will pretty frequently be a 10-10 weapon or a 12-12 weapon, which is pretty well worth it. It turns into an Armory situation for sure, where your go-wide strategy suddenly becomes about a single big weapon that's just killing a unit every turn, and then eventually you run out of armor. But if you smuggler stash this thing back, it'll still be the same size, and you'll also get a bunch of your tokens back to sacrifice to it, and it'll just get bigger and bigger and bigger. There's a lot of inevitability in the Callus deck, and I think it's quite strong. I think it might be Khalees. I'm not sure. I think I'm going to keep calling it Callus, but I could be wrong about that one. In any case, yeah, this card's pretty bananas. Really emphasizes a Stonescar control archetype. And yeah, it can be really, really good because there are a lot of cards like Assembly Line and Grounded and Drone that can just fill the board with stuff. And then this card also interacts well with cards like Torrent of Spiders because it puts a lot of units into the void, and Oblivion Spike because again, it puts a lot of units into the void. So there are cards that can back up your losses, and that means that like you can take advantage of the fact that you have sacrificed your entire board for a powerful effect in a lot of ways that Stonescar actually really likes. So that's what sort of really makes this card shine, is the fact that there are other cards that cover its weaknesses. In draft, I'm not sure that it's good. It's just a little bit awkward. It can be pretty good in some ways, but you really have to have like enough tokens to make the thing happen. Most of the time, if you're sacrificing your units to just kill something of theirs, then you're not really trading evenly, so you have to be pretty careful about it. Brimstone Altar. Once per turn, you may sacrifice a unit to deal 2 damage to the enemy player. Super strong card. The Madness effect, it's good with Madness in particular. Basically, Brimstone Altar and Madness almost always go in decks together. It has some strong interactions with cards like Bait. Any card with a cool Entomb, Brimstone Altar can have some fun with. It's also pretty okay with tokens. I don't really like sacrificing tokens to it, but it is actually a really good aggro archetype. You can just generate a ton of damage, and it's all unblockable, and you will kill your opponent over time. So Brimstone Altar has a lot of fun there. The deck sort of shifts between control and aggro in a really interesting way. Brimstone Altar is a very strange deck to build, a very hard deck to build, and not necessarily what I would say like you want your first ranked rare to be, or your first ranked deck to be, but it is pretty interesting, and if you're the kind of person who likes this type of effect, you can actually make good use of it. It's one of the harder cards to use in the game, I would say, and it can pay off very well. A lot of cool things that it interacts with. Scrap Tank, Grenadin Drone. I think it has very strong interactions in particular with Bait, Scrap Tank, and Madness. Those are all really solid. In draft, I would never play this card. It's just not good enough effect. Provides no board advantage. The extra damage is, well, I don't know. I guess I'd play it if I had enough tokens. Same as Khalees, but, or yeah, I don't know that I really love it here. It is pretty fun. It does sacrifice tokens, so if you have enough sacrifice effects, definitely run it in draft, but other than that, like it's just basically, if you have the ranked deck already, then you can play the altar. Champion of Chaos. +3 fire, +1 strength and overwhelm. Or yeah, if you have 3 fire, you have +1 strength and overwhelm. If you have 3 shadow, +1 strength and deadly. This card's pretty bananas. The combination of overwhelm and deadly is an important interaction that you really want to note. It's similar to the interaction between deadly and quick draw in that it has a little bit of a surprise to it. So when you attack with something into a unit, when you attack a unit into another unit and the unit has deadly and overwhelm, it will deal 1 point of deadly damage, and then the rest of it will overwhelm. So Champion of Chaos that is a 5/3 overwhelm deadly will deal 1 damage to every blocker, and then the rest of it will all go to your opponent. That means that Champion of Chaos is pretty typically a burn spell that hits face pretty hard. A lesser Obliterate on a stick. It's just very, very nasty. Not only can this card just kill your opponent really, really fast, a 5/3 for 3 is super efficient, but it's also just not capable of being blocked in a productive fashion. Argenport Instigator means that this card always deals 5 damage to your opponent's face, because every single unit that blocks it will just add to Argenport Instigator's pings, and then it'll still deal the extra damage. Yeah, Champion of Chaos needs to be shut off in order to stop killing you. It's a very, very strong card in Stonescar burn archetypes. It's a super good champion. It's one of the best champions, and yeah, I really, really like it. Card's strong in draft, no doubt about it. Just pretty legit, so yeah. Play it if you can. Bandit Queen, 3/2 charge. Summon your units, gets +1 strength and quick draw this turn. Queen decks have been dominating for a pretty long time. People keep finding cool ways to make them good. It is a very strong effect. It's better than a rally in a lot of different ways. The main thing about this is that Bandit Queen acts as a 4 damage burn spell in games where you have no tokens and you got lightning stormed out. So that's something that actually is very relevant, and it's something that rally decks cannot do. Bandit Queen will generally make most of your units unblockable for a turn, which means that you can set up for another big Bandit Queen next turn. You can set up for more rallies. You basically just get to keep all of the units that you sent out in a suicidal charge in a really fun way. So yeah, she's pretty strong effect. The main risk to her, of course, is that she is vulnerable to Lightning Storm, but usually by the time she comes down, your opponent is so low that it no longer matters, and as a result, Burn Queen is a very strong ranked archetype. This card is just as strong in draft as it is in ranked. You will usually be pushing damage in Stonescar. The quick draw effect is super strong. This card is very deceptively powerful, and she's also one of the marquee cards of the set, I would say. Bandit Queen's art is also just like, yeah, Bandit Queen's art is super cool. You'll see her on a lot of the promo materials. She's a sweet card in general. Gunslinger rogues are neat, and I really like her. Yeah, good design, a lot of good things about her, and happens to be a pretty dominant Stonescar card, so crazy fun times. All right, Black Iron Manacles. At the end of each turn, deal 1 damage to the cursed player for each card that player drew or discarded this turn. This card has maybe the most confusing art in the set. I'm not actually like 100% sure what's going on here. I think that it's like sort of, yeah, no, it's really unclear. It's sort of like a spirit being bounded by manacles, or the spirit is inside the manacles. There's something up with this art, but nonetheless, it's a pretty decent card. At the end of each turn, the effect is a little bit minimal, so it doesn't really kill players very fast. It does make control decks cry, though. It is just very, very mean. So if your opponent is playing cards like Second Sight, if they're playing cards like Secret Pages, oh my gosh, does this card do terrible things to Secret Pages? Because Secret Pages draws itself twice, which is 2 damage, and then it also draws power, which is another damage. So there's 4 damage for every Secret Pages that your opponent has. That's not an amazing time. Black Iron Manacles is a hard card to deal with. It's a good way to deal a bunch of damage over time. It's a good way to just sort of hate on control decks. It doesn't do a whole heck of a lot else. It's pretty bad at tempo and just generally like developing, so you mostly only want to play it in a control heavy meta. I wouldn't play this in draft. You pretty much can only play it if your deck is super defensive. Like if you're playing like purple, red, yellow, and you have Dune Phantoms and Lumen Defenders, then you can just kind of sit back and let Manacles do its work. Unpreventable damage is always nice. This card is basically just a burn spell that only hits face, but it often hits face for a lot of damage, so it's something to consider, but often not worth spending turn 4 for. Oh yeah, Find the Way. Did I say Secret Pages? I will do that a lot. Secret Pages used to be called Find the Way, or Find the Way used to be called Secret Pages. Statuary Maiden. Deadly. Enemy units that die transform into +2/+2 cudgels. You draw them. So this is a very powerful effect in terms of the long game. It's crazy good. The thing about this card that I think is worth noting is that it is actually just not as good as Steward of the Past. Or at least it is as good as Steward of the Past, but in a different way. It's very, very similar to the card. Both of them cost 4. Both of them have an effect that really, really hates on units that want to resurrect themselves. Both of them prevent units from going into the void in a meaningful fashion. Statuary Maiden completely removes them from the void, which is more powerful, but it doesn't affect units that are already in the void, which is less powerful. It has less stats than the Steward of the Past, which is quite a bit less powerful, especially since a 2/4 is functionally no different from a 3/5 in terms of the game's removal, but the deadly effect is exactly the same, and it's pretty powerful as well. I do not like Statuary Maiden as much as Steward of the Past in most situations. However, if I really want to hate on someone's void, that is a very good card to do it with. This card also interacts really well with some particular decks that have high amounts of removal, because you can get really, really big units out of it. You can have a lot of fun with it. Armory decks really like it, actually. It's not bad in Armory. It is pretty solid in certain other decks where you can like run just a load of removal. So yeah, anything with Harsh Roll in it is actually pretty fun with Statuary Maiden. It makes a fun 3-color splash. And yeah, I do like this card in addition to Steward of the Past. You sometimes just cannot have enough Void hate. The Void is a very powerful resource, and if you're really intent on shutting it down, Statuary Maiden is the card. Yeah, this card is very good in draft. This card is very good in ranked. It is only by virtue of being slightly weaker than Steward of the Past for me that I do not like this card, but it is just a solid B+. All right, Runic Revolver. 2/2 quick draw summon, deal 2 damage to the enemy player. Does not see play in ranked at all. A card that is sometimes worth picking in draft, but rarely. It has good interactions with Warcry. Basically turns it into just a constant removal spell that never ever dies to anything. Like, you can just establish complete dominance with a Runic Revolver if, in fact, you have just a ton of Warcries on it. And yeah, no, it's really, really crazy if you can make this card like a 5/5 or a 10/10, because a draft deck is just not equipped to deal with that in any fashion. It also does push damage in a way that's pretty effective in draft. In ranked, this card hasn't seen a lot of play for pretty good reasons. The stat line's pretty weak. It doesn't deal with big enough threats, but I would say the same thing in ranked that I would say about it in draft. If you can get enough Warcries and effects on it, it actually functions as like a lesser last word. And there may be some strength to that. Pretty hard to do, though. I can't think of any way to reliably buff this card. So as a result, doesn't see much play yet. Look at set 2, maybe it'll end up having some cool Johnny interactions with it. But like, the combo potential is just not there yet. So yeah. Interesting draft card, pretty bad ranked card. Scrap Tank. Summon, play 2/1/1 Grenadin. When one of your units dies, when one of your other units dies, Scrap Tank gets +2/+2. There are ways you can trigger this ability before your opponent can do anything about it. Brimstone Altar is one. Devour is one. Anything where you can actually just actively blow up a bunch of your units will make Scrap Tank really, really big, and typically too big to deal with in very short order. But most of what Scrap Tank does is, in a token deck, you plop him down, you attack with a bunch of your tokens, and suddenly your opponent doesn't want to block any of your tokens anymore. Like, having a big Scrap Tank is a big deal, because this card very quickly gets out of range of Obliterate and out of range of weapons, like relic weapons. So yeah, it can be a pretty rough card. In addition, it always creates 2/1/1 Grenadins, which means that there's basically no way to deal with this card that doesn't leave something behind. That's sort of the definition of a good value card. If there's no way to kill the card that actually just, like, apart from Harsh Rule, there's no way to kill this card that doesn't mean that you are trading at least 1/1 while still leaving some Grenadin on the board. So Scrap Tank has good interactions with Khalees decks, with Praxis decks, with anything that's token-centric. Scrap Tank is a pretty solid addition. Really fun card. Rhino played this in his Praxis deck with Shadow, and that archetype is really, really strong. I like it a lot. Yeah, cool card. Very good in draft, just out of control. No way to stop it. Like, it gets too big too fast, and it pushes damage, and yeah, nuts. Smuggler Stash. Draw 2 units and 2 weapons from the void. So, Primal is the card draw faction, but Smuggler Stash is the only card in the game that draws 4 cards. It is pretty ridiculous and very, very effective, and the reason that Armory is such a really strong archetype. Armory decks could probably live without Smuggler Stash, but the presence of it is what makes them so strong. It is just really, really good at making any deck that wants to go to the long game in Stonescar colors absolutely insane, and it enables that control archetype in a way that is just very, very powerful and very, very effective. This card is just bananas value most of the time. Every once in a while, you want to play it just to draw 2 units from the void, because it's pretty hard to balance units and weapons in a way that you are going to get all 4 of them in your void at the same time. It's perfectly reasonable to draw 3 units off of Smuggler Stash, or draw 3 cards off of Smuggler Stash. You should never wait for Smuggler Stash if you don't have anything else to do on your turn. Or, like, very rarely you should wait on Smuggler Stash. Yeah, this card will also get back things that have been buffed by Warcries, which are pretty common in Armory decks in particular. It'll get back things like Recano Artisan, which have very powerful summon effects that you can repeat. Yeah, this card is pretty bananas. It is a bomb draft card if you are playing slow. Just absolutely, like, if your deck is slow, if your deck has weapons at all, play Smuggler Stash, even splash for it. It's pretty crazy. Yeah, Nuts draw card, very situational. It is a significant tempo loss. You can very easily be murdered on the turn that you play it. So be pretty careful about when you play it and make sure that your deck has the necessary defenses to protect you while you are doing this kind of insane, like, take a turn off to draw a billion cards. Warband Chieftain. Entomb, give one of your units +5 strength. This card sees no play in ranked. It's got an okay stat line, but it's just a little bit too boring. The Entomb effect doesn't increase the survivability of the unit, so that makes it pretty not great against removal. It's kind of aggressive, but not so aggressive, and 5 cost is pretty expensive for an aggressive card. Nonetheless, the card actually does very well in draft. Like, it is just a really, really solid Entomb effect. It makes the card pretty annoying to block because there's almost always a flyer lurking in the air, like a scavenging vulture, and blocking the Warband Chieftain would just be worse than not blocking the Warband Chieftain. So this card will frequently push the damage that you need to win and do it in a really cool way. It interacts very well with quick draw units and flying units. Just a fun draft uncommon if your deck is going for the slower kill. Infernal Tyrant. Lifesteal, summon, deal 2 damage to each of your other units. So this card is a 6/6 that when it comes into play, sometimes kills some of your stuff, but more frequently just gains you like 8 or 9 health, or 8 or 10 health, which is 8 or 9 health. It cannot gain you 9 health, because it only does damage in even numbers. But yeah, so you can use this to trigger Entomb effects like Dark Wisp and Slumbering Stone, but I would not recommend it. It's much better to just play this card with cards like Argenport Instigator and Impending Doom and Champion of Chaos, all of which have 3 health or more. It is a bananas Stonescar card. Burn decks will actually run this, and basically this is what makes Stonescar midrange a thing. Or like what you would define as Stonescar midrange is a deck that runs 4 Infernal Tyrants. Yeah, card does a lot of things. If it is not removed, which it is fairly hard to remove, it will just seize control of the game in a really, really demanding fashion. Very good against armory decks because it's pretty hard to prevent that kind of life gain from just spiraling the game out of control. The 2 damage to each of your other units is not typically relevant, but sometimes does do some important things, like enable a bunch of flyers, or maybe kill something that you really needed to get killed. Does have some bad interactions, obviously. Cabal Countess can't really be played with it. Not amazing with a lot of different things that have 1 health. But yeah, the card is extremely powerful. Like, a 6/6 lifesteal for 6 is pretty reasonable, and the summon effect means that it is getting some sort of value the turn that you play it, which is always relevant to your giants, basically. Any sort of big unit, you want to see some sort of board impact immediately, and the health gain is good enough. Stonescar Leviathan. 7/7, Entomb, the enemy player's health becomes 7. So, hard to get this card out cheaty ways, but the more often that you can do it, the better off it is. Your opponent can use this to heal, but it's not terribly effective. Like, there's very few situations where your opponent is like, oh, I'm at 3, now I'm at 7, and that helped. Like, it's not very likely that Stonescar Leviathan's Entomb becomes a drawback for you. The Entomb, however, does set up your opponent for a perfect Flame Blast for 7, so yeah, it's a pretty strong ranked card in quite a few different situations. Doesn't see a lot of play. Pretty hard to set up the particular combo deck for this, but the main interaction I think is Brimstone Altar. You just play this into Brimstone Altar, and then you'll probably have Flame Blast because you're playing a weird burn deck. Yeah, can be pretty effective in that respect. And also, like, you can play this card as a blocker, and like, if you're not worried about silences, you can play it as a blocker, wait until the turn that you're going to kill your opponent, then sacrifice it to make your opponent's health 7, then Flame Blast. Pretty easy to get this kind of effect off. Some cool combos that you can do with it. Has a lot of potential. I think in draft it's pretty powerful just because it's a big dude. The Entomb effect is not as relevant in draft just because if it's a big dude, it's probably going to reduce your opponent's health to 7 pretty quick anyways. But there is always the chance that your opponent just won't kill it, which it seems... You know, like, it is sort of a pretty rough situation for your opponent either way. It's just a big 7/7 that's going to deal a bunch of damage to your opponent and set them up for a kill. So, yeah, potentially a strong draft legendary. All right, another one of my favorites, Voprex the Great Ruin. I like this card a lot, and people hate on this card sometimes. I think at this point it's been demonstrated pretty clearly that this is a real card. I still think it's stronger than people give it credit for it. But it's seen enough tournament play now that, like, you know, you can actually say, Voprex, this is a thing that happened. I have been a pretty staunch proponent of this card since day one, or not since day one, but for a pretty long time. You can check out my Greed Dragon YouTube videos. There's some really fun things you can do with Voprex. The thing about Voprex is that it's a 5/5 flying overwhelm that pretty typically kills at least one unit. Like, you know, your opponent has a thing on the board, you play Voprex, suddenly your opponent has no things on the board. There are situations where your opponent just has no cards in hand or no units on the board, and then you play Voprex and you feel kind of bad, but it's still a 5/5 flying overwhelm that's like hybrid colors, so pretty hard to kill. It's not an amazing card on its own if you don't get the decision, but it's pretty rare that you don't see yourself in a position to get that decision. The thing about Voprex is that it is a 7-drop that doesn't win you the game. So that's something that you really have to be aware of. Like, basically, this card is not a bomb in the traditional sense of the word. It is a card that will basically force your opponent to make tough choices. And if you can get it out fast enough, if you can get it out at the right times, you can basically just turn a situation that was a loss into a potential win. And Voprex will do that for you. Voprex will do that quite well. Works well against the current Chalice archetype, because the Chalice archetype tends to have a lot of units on the board and a lot of units in hand. Anything where you are playing pretty slowly, like a mid-range deck, often doesn't really want to decide between the 3 cards they have on the board and the 3 cards they have in hand. Voprex can get so much card advantage that it's pretty disgusting, but you do still have to have follow-up. So that's something to pay attention to. I think this card's strong in ranked or draft, and yeah, can be very, very solid. That summon effect is just a really interesting decision that they can make. But of course, the enemy player doesn't have to can choose to discard an empty hand or sacrifice a board with no units. One interesting interaction to note, and I guess that's a weird note to leave out on, but we are going on to the colorless cards. This card, when it causes your opponent to sacrifice all of your units, that is not like a Magic the Gathering interaction. Aegises do protect the units on the board. They will not die. So that's something to pay attention to because it's actually quite relevant. And it means that Voprex is unfortunately not a counter to Akaria the Liberator. But still, neat card, does a lot of cool things. Okay, so we have a couple more cards left, primarily the colorless ones. Seek Power, the most important card in Eternal. Play this card. Play 4 of this card. Play 4 of this card in every deck. Like, that's my best advice to you if you are new to the game. Just play 4 of this in every deck. Every deck. Just every deck. Eventually, you will find out that there are certain decks that do not like having 4 Seek Power in them. Like, specific Rakano decks, super aggro stuff, new Tomorrow combo decks that don't want to have power in there, like don't want to have power seekers. That's actually, even in those situations, I think Seek Power is actually good enough that you should be running it. If you're playing mono time, then Find the Way can sometimes be an alternative to Seek Power that's pretty legit. If you're a monocolored deck, run Favors, but also possibly run this. Like, it might be worth it. Depends on your mono deck. Like, if you're a monocolored deck, like, you might actually want it. So yeah, no, the card it's insane. Basically, the only reason not to run it is if you have so many other time power fixers that you don't need to run it. I think my Praxis of Awesome deck, RAP Sinners is pointing out, doesn't have it. But like, if you're new, you don't have all of those cards yet, play Seek Power. Play all 4 of them. This card, I think, still sorts to the beginning. So if you like were to just, yeah, so you notice how it's not there at the start of the colorless cards? That's because it's at the front of the list. If you are looking at this list of cards, you will see that Seek Power is forward. It is the #1 card. The reason for that is because you should be playing 4 of them, and if you didn't, well, that's bad on you. But no, this card's most important. Do it. Do it. Play this card. Play this card. Play this card. Eternal Basics lesson, like, I don't know if this is like lesson number 7, but like basically I think I have an entire video where it's just like, no, play this card. This card is the most important. Diplomatic Seal, if you have 2 or fewer influence, gain an influence of your choice. Not an alternative to Seek Power, but something that you actually do want in certain decks that are more aggro. Yeah, no, it is an alternative to Seek Power. It goes in Rakano decks that want to play efficient power, but don't need to play big influence units. Sometimes Deep Forge Plate decks can run this, but I wouldn't really recommend it, maybe 2 of. If you're going any deeper than 4 different influence, then you should never run Diplomatic Seals. This card, however, does work pretty well in 2-color decks that don't have deep influence requirements. Basically, if you don't have anything that costs 3 influence, then you're probably fine running Diplomatic Seal. This card is pretty good at just basically making you gain an influence of your choice. It does reduce the number of effective sigils in your deck, which means that you can't play as many Seats of Power. So that's something important to note about it, but it's not actually a big enough drawback that this card isn't good for fixing. This card is quite strong in aggro decks. It is the alternative to Seek Power in those situations where you don't want to run Seek Power, which is not very often. Thoughts on Nictotraxian will be coming. We'll cover that one last because why not? It's pretty great. Spiked Helm, not really playable. I was just commenting that I might actually play this in draft over certain other cards. It does have one particularly fun effect, which is that in Oni Quartermaster decks, if you have enough Oni Quartermasters, Spiked Helm suddenly becomes a possibility, because you can play Oni Quartermaster, play a Spiked Helm on it, your opponent doesn't get a chance to respond, so Spiked Helm buffs the Oni Quartermaster and draws you a card, and that's pretty cool. That combo's not amazing, it's not going to win you a lot of games, so it's not a good ranked card, and it's probably never going to be a fun draft card. If you're super hyper aggro draft, or you're super hyper aggro ranked, then there is like a 1% chance that you might want a Spiked Helm in your deck for some reason. Just like being able to play a +1/+1 4/0, I'm not going to discount that. That could be okay in Warcry decks that want to deal an immense amount of damage very, very fast. But it's not terribly likely. Card's pretty low on value. Still, a fun card. I really like Quartermaster combos with Spiked Helm. This card is not terribly playable otherwise. One of the things you'll notice about most of the colorless cards is that they are typically cards being played either by computers or just as sort of a lesson in what bad cards are. Being colorless means that you can play them in draft, so there are not that many good colorless cards, and so that's something that we're going to see as sort of a general theme. Like Warren Shield, this card's not terribly good. Does protect your opponents from Torch, does protect 3/3s from most nasty spells. There are some things that you can put Warren Shield on that will be more survivable as a result, but it's mostly just a really weak effect. Basically, you only play this if you're in a draft game and you have a unit that absolutely has to not die, and you just don't have enough protects and finest hours and any other thing that will keep that unit alive. I can't think of another reason to run it, so yeah, no, if there's something that like it's really important it doesn't die, like your entire game plan is based around Order of the Spire, then maybe you could play this, but again, this is like a 1% chance. Just no. Cambrai Stranger and all fixing strangers. We're going to just talk about all of them at once. So these guys are really important in draft. They're actually pretty okay in ranked too, but they're really important in draft. You should be picking these guys up if you are in whatever particular set of colors that they are in. You should also probably be valuing them relatively highly if they fix for even one of the colors that you are in. Cambrai Stranger is, yeah, like any of these strangers will just make it so that in a hand where you would otherwise lose a game, you don't lose that game. Like that's pretty much all there is to it. If you have a Cambrai Stranger, probably once per draft, the Cambrai Stranger is going to fix your power, and it's going to allow you to play a hand that was a monocolored hand that you would not otherwise be able to play. Maybe that's your first hand, like a hand that you really wanted to keep, but you wouldn't otherwise be able to keep because you have only 2 colors in it. Maybe it's your second hand, which you drew into because you didn't have the right power in your first hand, and now you don't have the right power in your second hand, except this guy's here to save you. These cards are actually really important in draft, and you should be valuing them somewhat highly. You should get at least 2 or 3 of them. You shouldn't get too many, but until you have 2 or 3 of them, you should not be satisfied. We just played a 5-color draft game, brought it to 6-3. I got like a nasty comment about how lucky I was, and I was like, yes, I was very lucky. I got strangers, I got amber acolytes, I got seek powers. I had all of the things that were super lucky for me because I picked all of those cards, and yeah, that allowed me to run a 5-color deck because strangers and other fixing really important. So yeah, stranger's a good card. Daze, stun an enemy unit, not a good card. Could be playable in draft if you have, I would say, 4 or more icebreakers. If you have 4 or more icebreakers, maybe you can run Daze. Most of the time, probably ignore this. Flash Freeze is a better card in general, and it's mostly for like an aggro archetype. The art's pretty cute though. Fun little colorless, cutesy card for the early gauntlet opponents to play. Stranger. I have no idea why Combre Stranger is first. That's really strange. Some sort of ordering issue. Alright, anyways, these cards are all good. Alchemical Blast, probably the most playable colorless common. It is deal 2 damage, and that's okay in draft. You might want this. Like, you need removal in draft, so if you aren't getting enough of it, pick up Alchemical Blasts. They'll do a job for you. They aren't very good at establishing tempo, but they do kill threats, and you need to kill threats sometimes, so Alchemical Blast is worth picking up in some situations. Forsworn Stranger, +1/+1 for each type of influence you have. Good with the other fixing strangers, especially in draft. This card probably has some potential in ranked as well. Like, there are 5-color stranger decks that are going to want this card. Having a 5/5 stranger that has all of the other buffs of all of the other strangers is not a bad deal. This card can be really, really efficient, and I'm really glad that it's a stranger. And yeah, it makes strangers better. It is a pretty good card if you are playing 5-color strangers. Or 4-color strangers. In draft, you only need 3 to 4 colors to make Forsworn Stranger worth it. So, yeah, decent stuff. Is that all the colorless cards? Oh, man, I thought there were like some 4 and 5 drops as well. Nope, I guess not. So that's it, actually. It's good to know. I'm not sorting anything weird. Okay, so we got one more card to cover. As the only non-colorless card, Nictotraxian. Alright, so you may have played Clank. If you haven't played Clank, you should play Clank. It's actually pretty good. So on the top 100 of Board Game Geek right now, and it's by Direwolf Digital, and like, I'm pretty happy with it. I have the first copy of it. I'm aiming to get the expansion because I played it a bunch last weekend, and I found it really fun. I love deck building games, and yeah, surprise plug for Clank. No surprise, I do like that game. Yeah, it's pretty solid stuff. My friend consulted on it a little bit, but like, it's just a really good game, and it's a really good deck builder, and it's a better deck builder than Ascension, which is something that I was really, really fond of for a long time because it was a game that I could play with people who didn't want to play Dominion. This is that same thing, but better. Anyways, go play Clank if you haven't played it. It's pretty cool. Nictotraxian is the dragon from Clank. She's also Curiox's sister. So Curiox the Collector has a sister named Nictotraxian. She will yell about Clank when she comes into play. She's a really fun card. I like this card a lot. The design's really cool. She's a really cool dragon in general. Just like the quintessential dragon. It's nice to see her. 5 colors, 8/8, flying, fate, create, and draw a random card. So yeah, there's a lot of cool things about this card. The create and draw a random card effect is pretty strong. It's one of the earliest randomization effects that you can get, and one of the best randomization effects that you can get. This is like the most Hearthstone-y card, and that's fine. It's okay to have some good randomness effects. It's not like the end of the world if it does exist, and I think that this one in particular is a really fun implementation. So Nictotraxian actually provides a lot of power to most decks, mostly because the random card is pretty relevant, but the dragon body is also relevant. So that means that she's just 2-for-1 card advantage all the time. But you do have to be in 5 colors, which means that it's pretty tricky to run her, and that means that you pretty much have to run her if you're going to be building a deck around her. You can see some videos on Nictotraxian control if you want to on my Eternal Brews. It's just called Nictotraxian control. It's a really fun deck because it just basically twin forms her and second sights her and does all of the cool things. She's just a great card for doing that. She does a lot of fun stuff. You get to make all of this random garbage and play it out, and you get to play cards that you wouldn't otherwise get to play. You get to experiment with like all the different cards in the Eternal deck. I think this card's way fun to play. I also think that she's pretty powerful. Nictotraxian control is a legit archetype. It's not tier 1, but it is playable, and it outplays a lot of other control decks just on sheer value. There's a version of her that runs Crown of Possibilities that I think is running around right now. I really like that version. I didn't find it as effective as just straight Nictotraxian control, but I think it's pretty decent. And yeah, like this card, if you could play her in draft, would probably be good, but you can't because she is a Jex Bounty card. So nonetheless, a fantastic design, a fun little homage to Clank. So like, and you know, it's a good example of how you do cards that are homages, or like, I can't remember the exact name of these. I was just listening to a podcast where Mark Rosewater was talking about these types of cards. But like a card that is an internal reference. It's just a really sweet dragon, and it's not readily apparent that it's a reference to another one of their board games, but like if you know that makes it a lot better. And also the dragon is just really sweet. Like this card is just amazing. It's such a fun design. It's very similar to Curiox in terms of just the fun of the design. Like there's so many cool things you can do with it. She's a fun Johnny card. In other words, she's a fun combo card. She's a fun card to play with and like build around. She is a really, really big, exciting dragon. She's actually pretty powerful. Those are, you know, like the 3 golden like things that make up a really fun card. And yeah, it's pretty exciting. I think that this is just a really neat card in general, and I really, really like her. And she's emblematic of like some of the cool things that are going on with Eternal, as well as just like, you know, some of the general fun of Eternal. So I think she's amazing. I think Eternal is amazing, and that is all of the cards in set 1, the Empty Throne. We finished this up just before set 2 comes out, so I'm looking forward to doing this again in just a couple of weeks. So thank you guys so much for watching. I am out for tonight, and I will see you next time. Bye.